is original 2017 Houston Astros World Series champions. I'm wearing it so none of you fuckers can call me a fake Houstonian. And if you don't like the Astros, suck it. Too bad, so sad, eat my entire ass. But this video is not about that. This video is because a lovely human being, an archivist by the name of Alexis Amber, who goes by Daiquiri Eris on TikTok, has personally invited me to tell my story about surviving storms growing up in Houston. And I wrote an entire personal essay about that, and I'm making it your problem too. So enjoy it. I'm going to be reading it for you today. It's called Storm Stories, or I Survived Climate Change and All I Got Was This Lousy Trauma. It was a joke in my family growing up in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, that we didn't evacuate for anything less than a Category 4 hurricane. I always thought this was because we were tough and could ride out the storm. Looking back, it was probably because both of my parents worked. My dad in finance, my mother as a preschool teacher's aide, so they would have had to take vacation and inconvenience my mother's side of the family to leave. Add on the stress of corralling 2 young children and various beloved family pets in the car, and it becomes understandable why we would want to stay put. The first hurricane I remember was Katrina. Houston wasn't hit. We got some rain my parents declared the plants could use, but that isn't why I remember it. I remember Katrina for the effects felt by my extended family in South Louisiana. My parental great-grandparents lived in New Orleans at the time and were fortunate enough to be able to evacuate. Later, my mother would ask if they had friends that took water or lost their homes in Katrina. They very bluntly told her something she repeats to this day to anyone who will listen. Heather, we had friends who died. That was the first time I ever knew a storm like that could kill you. Right after Katrina came Rita, but this time headed right for Houston. I remember tossing and turning the night before the storm was due to hit and falling asleep to the sound of my dad and his dad boarding up our windows. They'd already filled the bathtubs and committed to hunkering down with our 3 cats if the rest of us evacuated. In the middle of the night, my mother shook my sister and me awake. She told us to get dressed and ready to go because we were going to my grandmother's house. The adults around me held the fear of another Katrina close to their chests, but every little hint was enough for a perceptive child to cling to. Back then, we visited my grandmother a few times a year because my parents couldn't afford a real vacation yet. Only this was no vacation. This was evacuation. My 4-year-old sister and I dragged ourselves from our beds, rubbed the sleep from our eyes, and threw on clothes before piling into our mother's blue minivan with the built-in VCR. Armed with nothing but leap pads, Mary-Kate and Ashley and Disney movies on VHS, and the local Christian radio station, for which I still remember the station ID jingle, we set off for a house in the middle of the woods in North Louisiana. We made it to the Katy Freeway, and there we sat, and sat, and sat, until one of us in the back seat piped up to ask if we were getting close yet. We hadn't even made it out of Houston. We had been sitting since some ungodly hour in bumper-to-bumper gridlock traffic with every other Houstonian and suburbanite who'd come to the same conclusion as us. The day wore on, and the September sun beat down on the road while the little car air conditioner that could ran faithfully, keeping us cool. Then the fuel light blinked on, and my mother had to reckon with the fact that we were almost out of gas. So she made her way over, as if by magic, to the exit lane and left the evacuation route. In the age of George W. Bush, prices soared near $5 a gallon for gas. With plenty of grumbling about the president and how everything was getting so expensive these days, my mother acquiesced and found a gas station, where she was immediately greeted by bright yellow bags on every pump. "No gas," declared handwritten signs at stations up and down the freeway. More stations, more trying, still no gas. When at last we reached one that had not yet run out, we joined a line that stretched down the feeder road to fill up. I've told this story before. In my 4th grade class, we wrote and illustrated our own children's books. Mine was about Hurricane Rita. When I told the story then, the happy ending was that my desperate mother only made it to Humble before calling my dad on her pink Motorola Razr, turning around and driving us back to our own house when the storm barely hit us. It actually hit my grandmother's house much worse. In real life, as an adult, the ending's happiness rings hollow. I asked my mother how it felt to know she wouldn't make it out before the storm made landfall. She was scared. Katrina changed everything. Rita was the beginning of a new normal. I was 6 years old then, had just started kindergarten, and told my teacher one morning that my dad told me our family was French. I thought that meant we were fancy and European. What that actually meant was we were Cajun, a little bit on both sides, but mostly my dad's side. We were so Cajun, in fact, that my parents met at a bar while attending the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. After a brief stint in Virginia, then Austin, they found they couldn't stray too far from the Gulf Coast. So they raised me and my younger sister outside of Houston. My parents now say they weren't born in Texas, but they got here as soon as they could. Growing up, I knew a blend of Cajun and Deep South culture. My dad told me Boudreaux and Thibodeau jokes. My mother blessed people's hearts. I celebrated Mardi Gras by bringing purple, green, and gold beads to my elementary school classes. I went to the rodeo. The one thing both my cultures shared was storms. The next time I found out a major hurricane was hurtling towards Houston, I was pulled out of my 3rd grade class in the middle of the day. I asked my mother while sitting on the pleather seats in the back of her giant bright red SUV why she had to pull me and my sister out of school. She said she didn't want to get stuck trying to evacuate like last time. The trip to my aunt's house was uneventful. We stopped in Lufkin to get Chick-fil-A for dinner before plowing on to the town of Ruston, Louisiana. My dad stayed home with our elderly cats and waited for the storm to roll in. The Galveston seawall was the first hit. Then vacation rentals frequented by bored parents and prom after parties alike. Then my childhood home in the suburbs lost power. My dad texted my mother from his shiny new first-generation iPhone that he and the cats were okay. The power stayed off for days. Tree limbs blocked streets before men with chainsaws hauled them off. We finally returned to Missouri City after we heard word from my dad that the power was back on, and I had slept a few nights on the window seat in my cousin's room. For her 7th birthday, which we celebrated at my aunt's house, waiting out the hurricane, my sister received a Webkinz black poodle, whom she proceeded to name Ike. After the hurricane, we had just survived. What could be more Gulf Coast than naming your stuffed animals after their online equivalents after hurricanes you've lived through? As it turns out, mucking out your classmates and neighbors' houses, then bashfully approaching their parents asking them to sign your volunteer hour sheet for student council is more Gulf Coast than that. In 2015, as a freshman in high school, I learned the true meaning of turn around, don't drown. For all of Memorial Day, a heavy storm dumped rain on Houston while I sat at home planning out a final project. The next day, we woke up to a notice from my district superintendent declaring that school was canceled due to what we now remember as the Memorial Day floods. Since he said we could have the day off, I called up my 2 friends and English 1 project partners to come film a video about the books we'd read in class that year. After they left, I edited the video together and giggled at memes online about Houston sports teams and a flooded Whataburger that would henceforth be known as Waterburger. The next year, on tax day, Houston flooded again, in what we now remember as the tax day floods. As rain hammered against the roof and our rusted satellite dish refused to pick up any signal, my dad dug up rabbit ears and a digital converter box out of the attic and set our TV for over-the-air to watch KPRC Local 2 News and find out if school would be canceled. My mother promptly informed him of a Facebook post in my high school's parents group stating it was. We watched the names of private schools and public ISDs scroll across the screen for closures or late starts. I stared at my Twitter account, scrolling through meme after meme. One popped up of a man in rain gear wading through floodwater, wielding a downed tree limb with text overlaid reading, "You shall not pass." It eased my mind to think we could laugh about it and everything would go back to normal the next day, and my mother would drop me off at my high school in her blue crossover SUV. My parents had told me since I was a child global warming wasn't real. Climate change was a hoax. They had to change the name because it wasn't real. I couldn't trust science unless I could see the science encroaching. I could realize the mistake too late. I could find it irreversible. I felt a strong foreboding that the that the drainage problems in my city would only get worse. The damage was done. The predictions of when it would be drowned, swallowed by the water, drew closer every year. The minutes to midnight ticked up. BP spilled oil in the Gulf. The government just let them do it. The drilling continued. A ConocoPhillips lobbyist talked to my AP Environmental Science class about his job, and if we asked questions, we got branded merchandise. All my high school sporting events were sponsored by Chevron. My classmates' parents all worked in oil. My dad was a finance guy for a company that works with oil companies. Oil is the future. I can feel the future chasing me. It's catching up. Later that same year, catastrophic flooding hit South Louisiana. My dad's family was fine. His cousins with the more French-sounding last names than ours fared okay in the storm. But one of my mother's friends was a retired teacher whose family's house had flooded. A friend of my mother's friend was the principal of an elementary school in Denham Springs, Louisiana. She wasn't so lucky. Every single one of her teachers lost their entire class libraries and all their supplies. I was struck by how affluent of an area I lived in and how I and my peers could afford to give away some of what we had to others. The wheels started to turn. I reached out to schools in my districts to organize a donation drive. Elementary schools would collect books, middle schools would collect school supplies, and high schools would raise money. Almost every day after school for a few weeks, I drove around collecting donations, emptying bins. One day I came home from school and opened my car door and a waterfall of books cascaded from my passenger seat onto the driveway below. When the drive had concluded, we had a room in my childhood home dedicated to housing boxes upon boxes of what people had donated to help a community in need. My dad rented a U-Haul trailer, hitched it to the back of my mother's car, helped me pile the boxes in it, and drove me in the front seat and the U-Haul in the back to Denham Springs. I personally delivered the donations to the principal of 7th Ward Elementary. She walked me around the school, showing me the high water lines on the barren walls, and helped me and my dad unload the boxes from the U-Haul. Then my dad presented her with a check for the amount of money raised by my classmates' families and my own. She wept. The donations were shared among other elementary schools in the area. When Hurricane Harvey devastated my own city, upended the lives of my classmates and my community members, the families of Livingston Parish Public Schools organized a similar drive in my honor to help my community in Fort Bend ISD. The memory came up on my Facebook the other day. It made me cry. In 2017, just before my senior year of high school was about to start, I had my first job as a hostess at a local Italian restaurant. My coworkers started talking about there being rumblings of a storm in the Gulf. I said I hoped it wouldn't delay the start of the school year. Our school year already extended into June, and I only hoped a hurricane would not prolong it or cut into one of our breaks. That rumbling became tangible anxiety. I guided customers to their tables and cleaned menus. The local weatherman started to talk about Hurricane Harvey. By the time the owner of the restaurant told us the place would be closed for the storm, I could tell things were getting bad. No one spoke about or acknowledged the seriousness of Hurricane Harvey. My dad said we wouldn't evacuate if it wasn't a Category 5. He filled the bathtub, stocked up on candles, reminded us of what to do during our planned shelter-in-place. Our home was under voluntary evacuation. Still, we didn't leave. We didn't leave my home with our family dog in tow until we were placed under mandatory evacuation. At that point, we scrambled to reverse course. The sheriff's deputy knocked at our door to ensure we were leaving. The frantic dash to pack clothes, dog food, water, whatever we thought we'd need ensued. Then we piled into my mother's car and drove to her cousin's house in a safer part of the Houston suburbs, not far from our own home that had historically not flooded. My sister and I slept on twin beds, took our dog out to pee in the rain and the wind. The Hurricane Harvey stayed where it was. The rain hissed and the wind howled. Harvey unleashed a wrath upon the city of Houston that felt almost like divine punishment for some wrongdoing I couldn't begin to know. The power flickered from time to time, but it stayed on. My mother's cousin made gumbo with roux from a jar. Friends of mine swept water out of their houses with brooms. My dad braved the storm to sandbag the levee as the Brazos River lapped at the top of it. When the rain let up, a famous piece of bridge graffiti known to Houstonians as the Be Someone sign was underwater. Everything came to a standstill. My high school could not open because of the flooding. My friends, neighbors, and classmates had their lives ruined. People who had just moved into new construction houses in my neighborhood lost everything. My street was full of water that rose until it came to kiss the doorstep of my house and then receded. The craziest among us kayaked around the neighborhood. Alligators displaced from their usual hiding spots in retention ponds swam around freely. I spent my senior year getting volunteer hours for all the different clubs and honor societies I was in by mucking out houses. As a closeted lesbian in my late teens, I loved volunteering to do manual labor. I also spent many weekends working at a Habitat for Humanity pop-up where everyone who had lost their belongings in the hurricane could pick out new furniture for free. I was the shop's resident Spanish speaker, though I was just a plucky high school student in AP Spanish literature with something to prove to the world. And I proved it. Harvey wasn't that bad for me and my family, but families just a few streets over from me lost everything. I graduated in a community still reeling from a disaster unlike any they'd ever seen. Before I'd transferred to UNT and completed my 2 bachelor's degrees there, I started out at Tulane University in New Orleans. There I not only witnessed but understood the scar left by Katrina. The things my adult relatives described to the other adults in my life when I was a child too young to understand clicked into place like a puzzle. The things they spoke about in hushed tones materialized before my eyes. This was why my family all shook their heads when the subject of Bush came up. And I wondered then what would happen to the city I grew up in and loved after Harvey, and was there even worse to come? In 2021, natural gas froze in the pipes. Ted Cruz fled to Cancun, and Greg Abbott was nowhere to be found. Texans froze to death in their homes in Houston and in Fort Worth, where I had moved to. My parents opened all the cabinets and dripped the faucets and kept the heaters in all the bathrooms as the power waxed and waned. Their new home near TCU had a single pipe crack, but not so terribly it couldn't be repaired. Once again, we were unscathed. I went sledding and made snow ice cream while working on online college classes due to COVID's second wave. They blamed it on renewable energy when the grid failed. They knew better. Our politicians ducked out when things got nasty. They told us to set our thermostats to laughable temperatures. Online, an onslaught of comments on videos made by others told me my life didn't matter because I lived in a red state. I and my family and my neighbors and my friends and my classmates and my coworkers deserved to die. If you want my testimony like a Mormon, I'll proclaim from the rooftops, I know that climate change is real. I've seen it. I've had a ringing in my ears since 2005. It sounds like someone repeating over and over, turn back now. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Alexis, for asking me for my story.